Okay, next lecture for Unit 5. We're going to talk about some different types of neurons. If I can get there we go. All right, so we've already covered some information, of course, about neurons before, since we talked extensively about motor neurons during Unit 4. So some of these things you've heard before. Your neurons are very long-lived cells. You don't generally replace them, or at least that's been the thinking for a long time, is that our neurons don't really get replaced. So it really is true when you kill your brain cells from drinking too much beer or whatever when you're young, you really don't replace them as far as we know, or not very efficiently. So your neurons that you have, you've got to keep those for as long as you live. So if you're fortunate enough to live over 100 years, your neurons will survive that long. They're amitotic. That means that they don't do mitosis. And again, that's as far as we know. Some of those things are still being studied. They have a very high metabolic rate, so they do lots of cellular respiration. It takes a lot of energy to maintain the resting membrane potential, that charge difference, about minus 70 millivolts across the neuron membrane that we learned about during Unit 4. So they got to have lots of oxygen, they got to have lots of glucose, sugar to fuel all the cellular respiration they're doing. And of course, as we learned about, there's this electrical signaling that the membrane of neurons has to be able to perform. And neurons do these cell-cell interaction type things during development. I mean, you think about it, that makes sense. All this networking between the different neurons of your nervous system is pretty amazing for your body, in order for your brain to be able to control the function of your entire body. Pretty incredible. All right, we've seen this before, just kind of a quick review here of the anatomy of this is a motor neuron like we studied during Unit 4. So remember, the main part of the cell is called the cell body, and you're going to have a big nucleus, just like you would in any other typical cell. And then all these little branches you see extending off of the cell body, those are called dendrites. Those are receptive regions. That means that those are areas that receive signals, input, and generally that's going to be from other neurons. So in this unit, we're going to see a whole lot more of, all right, here's an axon from some other neuron, and its little synaptic knob there is forming a synapse, just like we saw between a motor neuron and a skeletal muscle fiber in Unit 4. But now we're going to be looking at synapses between different neurons, one neuron to another. And a single neuron, as we'll see, may form synapses with many other neurons that are connected to it and are trying to influence its behavior. Okay, and then remember, you got the axon. That's the long extension, generally, that travels from the cell body out to whatever it is that neuron is making contact with and trying to influence. This wider portion of the axon, where it connects into the cell body here, is called the axon hillock. Motor neurons have Schwann cells, these little blue ovals here. Remember, those are called Schwann cells, and they actually produce a substance called myelin, and myelin wraps around the axon and insulates it. It helps allow conduction of the action potential, that nerve impulse, to move a whole lot faster along an axon. That term neurolemma there more or less refers to the surface of these Schwann cells that you see here, where you actually have the cell body of the Schwann cell. The cell body of the Schwann cell is out near the surface, and all this myelin it is made is actually deeper and wrapped around the axon. The little open areas that are unmyelinated, those are called nodes of Ranvier. And then finally, your axon can branch out. You can have those are called terminal branches. And on the ends of those, you have a little wider area. Those are called axon terminals or synaptic knobs, and that's where your neurotransmitters get secreted, these chemicals that neurons secrete that are going to try to influence whatever it is that that neuron is forming a synapse with. Might be a gland, it might be a skeletal muscle fiber like we learned about last time, or many times it's just another neuron. And when we learned the motor neuron skeletal muscle fiber story in Unit 4, from these axon terminals, hopefully you remember acetylcholine was the chemical that was being secreted. So that is a type of neurotransmitter. And as we study this unit, we're going to see that there are many examples of other types of neurotransmitters that are used by different neurons, and those can have different effects on your nervous system. All right, so that was just a little quick overview. Now we've talked a little about some of this before, but we want to review it again here as well. Information flow with neurons. You know, think about it as being from dendrites to axons. So these dendrites, these little smaller branches you see over here, those receive signals often from other neurons. So you'll have an axon of another neuron has its little axon terminals, those synaptic knobs, forming a synapse. You're going to have a little gap there with a dendrite. Also, sometimes those synapses are formed over here on the cell body as well. They're not always on the dendrites. But dendrites are generally a receptive region. And all right, so when you've got a neuron that's forming a synapse with another neuron, it's going to be secreting a neurotransmitter, a chemical across the synapse. And as we're going to see, that neuron is going to be causing changes locally around the membrane, around where those synapses are formed. So it could be over here, it could be over here, could be over here, could be along the cell body there. And if we think about our membrane polarization graph, you know, as we've learned about before, you start off down here around minus 70 millivolts. That's the resting level. And as we're going to see, so when these other neurons are trying to influence this one, the influence occurs through changes in membrane polarization. So it might be causing the charge across the membrane to go up, or in other cases, it might be causing it to go down. So we'll see different examples of those. Now, as we learned about during, hang on, there we go. As we learned about in Unit 4, if this neuron is going to generate, hang on, my pen back up over here. If this neuron is going to generate an action potential, a nerve impulse, that decision gets made right here around the axon hillock. So remember, the axon hillock has to reach that threshold voltage, generally about minus 55 for a motor neuron. And once that happens, boom, you go through that action potential story. No, we're not going to go back through that all over again. If you need to revisit it, it's back in the Unit 4 content. But that axon hillock is where you've got to reach that threshold level. And if you do, you're going to get an action potential that travels all the way down the axon. And then this neuron might be forming synapses over here with another neuron, or it could be a gland, depends on the type of neuron. It might be smooth muscle that's present in the wall of a hollow organ, like your heart or the stomach or the large intestine, or it could be a motor neuron that's controlling skeletal muscle, just like we talked about back during Unit 4. Neurons control all types, many other types of things. So information flow tends to be dendrite to cell body to axon. And again, we say information, we're thinking about these changes in charge across the membrane. And only if the axon hillock depolarizes enough to threshold, and again, that's about minus 55 for a motor neuron that controls skeletal muscle cells, then that neuron is going to generate an action potential. So you've got all this networking that goes on in the nervous system between neurons with each other, And as we'll see, it gets pretty complex because you can have some neurons that are trying to get another neuron to depolarize and do an action potential, and then that neuron also might be receiving signals from other neurons that are saying, no, 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 you don't generate an action potential. I'm going to make it more difficult for you to do so. So the cell body area of the neuron is where those stimulatory or inhibitory influences get integrated together, and the decision gets made whether or not the axon hillock is going to reach threshold and that neuron is going to generate its own nerve impulse. Okay, structural classification of neurons. So neurons come in different types, and they can be classified according to their structure. The structure types are multipolar. That's what we've seen before, where you have one axon and several dendrites. That's what most of your neurons look like. That's the typical kind of neuron configuration we've seen before. Then there are neurons that are called bipolar, and no, that does not mean that they undergo major mood swings really easily. They just look different. We'll see some pictures of these in a minute. They have one axon and one dendrite rather than one axon and many dendrites. And then there are neurons that are called unipolar. They're actually pretty abundant as well. And they just have a single short process that has two branches. And so we'll take a closer look at that in a moment. So they don't really have a separate dendrite or a separate group of dendrites and a separate axon. It's actually just one long extension that goes from one location to another. And I just realized they're under unipolar. I've got single short process. I'm not so sure I agree with the short part there. I probably would scratch that out because some of those processes are not going to be short, as we'll see. Okay, so here's a table from your textbook here, which is just showing you some examples of these different types of neurons. Here's multipolar. And what they're showing you on here, they're showing you the shapes of the cells here, and down here they're highlighting or illustrating for you the part of the neuron that is the receptive region, so that is receiving stimulation, receiving signals generally from other neurons that are trying to control it. Or it could be, if it is a neuron that is involved in your senses, it might be receiving things like information about temperature damage, tissue damage, temperature changes, light, sounds, touch, pressure, things like that. So it's not always stimulation from another neuron. So in blue, they're showing you the receptive areas. In pink, it's the conducting region. So that's where your action potential travels down. And then in green, that is your secretory region. The secretory region is where the neurotransmitters, the chemicals, get released out of those axon terminals. So a multipolar, has multiple poles, neuron is like what we've seen before. You got lots of dendrites attached to the cell body. Those are the areas that receive signals. That's your receptive region, along with the cell body itself can receive signals. In pink, that long axon is the conducting region, and then over here at the ends of the axon, that's your secretory region. That's where those neurotransmitters get released. So that's like what we've seen before. A bipolar neuron, so notice the cell body here is in the middle, and then you've got this one long dendrite with some little branches on the end of it that extend out to one area, and then the axon goes in the opposite direction, and it can have some branches on it as well. So the receptive region can be all along here, all the way up toward the cell body, and then if the cell body receives enough stimulation, an action potential gets generated. That's why you see the axon there illustrated in pink or highlighted in pink. And then over at the other end, at the end of the axon, that neuron can secrete chemicals, neurotransmitters that will try to influence another neuron to do its signaling. Then finally, the unipolar neurons. The cell body might be kind of hard to see on this diagram, but we'll see some other pictures shortly. The cell body tends to be off to the side, kind of like that, and then there's a little short branch, and then there's one extension or process. So it's kind of sitting off, cell body's off to the side, and then over here you've got some branches. These are what you typically see with neurons that are involved in many of your senses. So you've got those little branches off to the side. This is your signal receiving area that they've highlighted in blue right there. And then your action potential actually travels, if you get enough depolarization and this neuron needs to generate an action potential, it actually starts over here and extends all the way along that process. And then finally you reach this other end over here, and this is your secretory end where neurotransmitters or chemicals are going to be released from that neuron. So those are your three anatomical types or structural types of neurons. And then neurons can also be classified functionally. What is it that they do? So, and we've heard these terms before. Sensory neurons transmit impulses from the periphery or from major organs toward the CNS. Now, many of those are unipolar. Not all of them, but many of them are. Motor neurons send outgoing signals from the CNS to effectors. So an effector here could be the smooth muscle in the wall of a hollow organ. It could be a skeletal muscle, but those are outgoing impulses, and those are generally going to be multipolar in shape. And finally, your interneurons, which can also be called association neurons, they bridge the incoming and the outgoing signals. So generally, these incoming impulses head towards the spinal cord or the brainstem or maybe even the brain itself, and then you've got interneurons that then provide this networking that's going to take place, like, say, from the spinal cord up to the brain so the brain can make decisions about it. And then they're also going to provide the networking to, once the brain makes a decision, you've got to send impulses downward back toward whatever effectors are going to carry out the task that needs to be carried out. So the interneurons are going to bridge these two types of neurons. They network the two. And many of those look like multipolar. They're multipolar in type as well. Okay, and so this table from your which you guys can actually just go back into chapter 11 and read through this table, but like I kind of described, here's there's a nice little picture here showing you some networking between an interneuron in the spinal cord and a motor neuron that's going to stimulate a skeletal muscle to contract. The bipolar neurons, and those are generally going to be multipolar neurons. Bipolar are kind of uncommon. They're sensory type neurons, but you mainly find them in the eye. They're involved with our sense of vision. They're sitting in the retinas on the back of the eyeballs where you have your light reception that takes place. And then again, your unipolar type neurons, those are sensory neurons which conduct incoming information. So from places like the skin and vital organs toward the spinal cord, in many cases, if not the majority of cases, but then in other cases, sometimes that incoming information is going, straight to the brainstem rather than the spinal cord. All right, so that's just an overview of some of the different neuron types. We'll also see some of that over on the anatomy side as well. Next lecture, we're going to talk a little bit more about central nervous system tissues and structures.